The classroom was quiet except for the soft shuffle of papers and the low hum of the air conditioner. The kind of sound that seemed to settle into the walls of the room, almost familiar now, even though this was my first time sitting in a class in years. I had enrolled, quite unremarkably, in a night course at the local community college. The kind of thing people did when they had more time than they knew what to do with. And that was me, right then. A man with too much free time. Too much space between the life I had lived and the life I wasn't sure I wanted to start. When I first walked into the room, I had no idea what to expect. I was just a man trying to find something to fill the hours. I was in my early 60s, a little slower than I used to be, but the curiosity was still there. I wanted to be challenged again, to feel like I was growing in some way. The subject didn't matter much at first, just something to get me out of the house, something that could, at the very least, stop the clock for a couple of hours. Then I saw her. She wasn't what I expected. No, not at all. In fact, I had anticipated someone a lot older, someone I could easily match in age or experience. But there she was, standing at the front of the room, organizing a few papers. She was in her 40s, I guessed. Her hair was dark, streaked with hints of silver, tied back in a loose bun that didn't quite cover the strands that fell by her face. There was a kind of authority in the way she moved, though it wasn't harsh or overbearing. It was quiet, yet commanding, like she knew exactly who she was, and more importantly, she knew what she was doing. Her name was Mrs. Whitmore, and though I couldn't place it at first, there was something in the way she introduced herself, soft but firm, that made me take notice. The way she didn't rush, didn't seem in any hurry to get through the day. She took her time. Welcome, she had said, offering a small but warm smile. This is an adult learning class. We're here to explore, to engage, and maybe, just maybe, learn something new about ourselves. Something about that smile stuck with me. Not because it was particularly inviting, but because it felt like she was speaking directly to me. It was as though she knew the people in this room had stories behind their faces, stories they hadn't quite worked out yet. And maybe, just maybe, I was one of those people. I tried not to stare, but it was hard not to. She had a kind of presence that made it easy to forget that I was just another student in the back of the room. She wore a simple blouse, but there was something in the way it fell over her frame that made it elegant. Her eyes, bright, attentive, and warm, moved slowly around the room, meeting each person, acknowledging their presence before she turned back to her notes. The rest of the class was uneventful. A few people tried to engage, offering their thoughts on the subject matter. But my attention kept drifting back to Mrs. Whitmore. There was a subtle grace to the way she carried herself, a quiet intelligence in her words. She didn't rush to fill silences, and she certainly didn't demand attention. It just came. Naturally. Effortlessly, and it was then, somewhere between the dry notes on the subject at hand and the occasional soft chuckle from one of the students, that I started to feel something I hadn't expected. A kind of pull. A magnetic force that I couldn't explain. I wasn't foolish enough to think it was romantic. No, it wasn't that kind of connection. It was something more, subtle. By the end of the session, I knew that something had changed. Maybe it was the way she answered my question, or maybe it was just the fact that I had felt seen. But I left the room with the distinct feeling that I wasn't simply taking a class. I was on the verge of something more. Something deep and maybe even a little unsettling, and I knew I would be back. I had to be. That night, I lay awake thinking about her, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't some fantasy of a teacher and a student, nothing like that. Instead, it was the feeling of her presence in the room, how everything around me seemed to fade when she spoke, how even the smallest details about her, the way she adjusted her glasses or how her voice softened when answering a question, felt like they were etched in my mind. Was this what it meant to connect with someone? I wasn't sure. But I knew one thing for sure, I hadn't felt this way in a long time. Not since I was much younger. I tried to push the thoughts away as I drove to class the next evening. There was no reason to get so worked up about a teacher. A woman, yes, but just a woman, nothing more. Still, the thought of seeing her again made my heart beat a little faster. I kept reminding myself to stay grounded. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a class. When I arrived at the classroom, Mrs. Whitmore was already there, organizing materials for the session. But tonight, she seemed a little different. The air around her felt charged, like something was about to happen. She looked up as I entered, her eyes locking with mine for a brief moment before she smiled. "Good evening," she said, her voice soft, but with a warmth that felt personal, as if she were speaking only to me. "I'm glad you came back." And I knew, then, that I hadn't just come back for the class. The second class felt different. There was an underlying tension in the air, something that hung between us like a thread just waiting to snap. Or maybe it was just me, perhaps I was imagining things, caught up in the quiet rhythm of our interactions. I couldn't be sure. But something had shifted. I felt it the moment I stepped into the room, the moment our eyes met again. Mrs. Whitmore greeted each student as they arrived, her smile just as warm as the first time. But when she saw me, it lingered for a second longer. A brief flicker of something in her eyes, something unspoken, something I couldn't quite place. It was as if she, too, felt the change. She didn't say anything about it, of course. That would have been too much. But I could sense it, like a subtle shift in the space between us. A magnetic pull that seemed to grow with every passing second. The class began as usual. She stood in front, leading us through a discussion about the subject at hand, but I couldn't quite focus. My mind kept drifting back to her, the way she moved, the way she spoke. Every gesture seemed to carry weight. Every word was measured and deliberate. I watched her, and I realized that for the first time in a long while, I felt completely absorbed in someone else. I didn't just hear her voice, I felt it. Every syllable seemed to resonate in my chest. It wasn't just her physical presence, it was something deeper. There was a calmness in her that drew me in, a stillness that made the rest of the world fade into the background. When she spoke to me directly, I was caught off guard. Her tone was always gentle, but tonight there was an edge to it, a slight lilt that made it feel personal. "Mr. Jensen," she said, turning towards me after asking a question. Her gaze softened as she met my eyes. "What do you think?" The way she said my name, so effortlessly, so naturally, felt different this time. Like it was something she had been waiting to say. I blinked, realizing that I'd been staring at her. I quickly cleared my throat and answered her question, trying to regain my composure. But my heart was pounding. We continued on with the lesson, but every glance in her direction, every word exchanged between us, felt laden with a quiet significance. The classroom seemed to shrink around us, making the space between us feel charged, like we were the only two people in the room. Every small movement she made, a hand brushing her hair back, a slight tilt of her head when she listened to a response, felt amplified. And then, halfway through the class, she asked something that made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't expected. "Mr. Jensen," she said, her voice still soft, but there was something different about it now, something more intimate. "How does this topic relate to your own life?" The question itself wasn't unusual, but the way she asked it, the way she looked at me while waiting for my answer, made it feel like we were having a private conversation. The rest of the class was still engaged, but in that moment, it was just the two of us, and I wasn't sure what to do with the emotions that started to surface. I hesitated, not sure how to respond. My life didn't feel very interesting at the moment. Sure, there had been moments in the past, things I had done, people I had loved, but that was all years ago. The years had dulled the edges of those memories. But as I looked at her, something stirred inside me. I wasn't just talking about the subject anymore. I wasn't even talking about myself, really. I found myself telling her something real, something I hadn't shared with anyone in a long time. I told her about my wife, how we'd spent so many years together, building a life. How after she passed, I'd lost that sense of purpose. How everything felt aimless, as though I were floating through my days with no real direction. There was a moment of silence, and I felt exposed. Vulnerable. But Mrs. Whitmore didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She just listened, her eyes steady and kind, and when I was finished, she nodded. "I understand," she said quietly. "Sometimes, it takes a while to figure out who you are again after something like that. I hadn't expected her to say that. I had expected something more detached, more professional. But she spoke with such genuine empathy that I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. Her words didn't try to fix anything, but they acknowledged the weight of it all. And in that moment, I realized that I had been looking for someone to see me, not just the person I had become, but the person I had been before everything changed. The rest of the class passed in a blur, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. Something quiet, but profound. When the bell rang, signaling the end of class, I stood up slowly, reluctant to leave the room. As I gathered my things, I noticed Mrs. Whitmore had lingered by the door, talking to a few of the other students. She caught my eye as I passed her, and for the briefest of moments, our gazes locked. "Good night, Mr. Jensen," she said, her voice softer than before. "I'll see you next week." I nodded, but I didn't speak. Instead, I walked out into the hallway, feeling the familiar weight of the evening air against my skin. But something inside me had changed. A door had opened that I hadn't been expecting to walk through. And I wasn't sure where it would lead, but I knew I couldn't go back to the way things were before. That night, I went home and sat in my chair, staring at the empty space around me. My mind kept replaying the evening, those small moments, those quiet exchanges. I realized, with a kind of shock, that I had felt something genuine for the first time in years. Something that wasn't just about nostalgia or missing the past. It was about connection. And though I couldn't explain it fully, I knew this was just the beginning. Mrs. Whitmore had unlocked something inside me, something I hadn't known I was missing. And whether or not it was intentional, whether or not she even realized it, I felt like I was finally starting to understand what it meant to truly engage with someone again. As I closed my eyes that night, I couldn't help but think about her. Not in the way you might think. No, it wasn't a schoolboy crush. It was something quieter, something deeper. And for the first time in a long time, I was curious about where it might take me. The following week passed slowly. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't shake, and though I tried to go about my days normally, everything seemed to lead back to Mrs. Whitmore. The way her voice lingered in my thoughts, the way her smile had seemed to change the atmosphere in that small classroom. I couldn't help but think about our conversation, the way she listened so intently, as though she understood the quiet weight of loss and time in a way I hadn't expected. Every time I drove to class, I found myself replaying moments from the previous sessions in my mind, trying to make sense of everything. Was I overthinking it? Was I simply starved for connection, for understanding, and had I misinterpreted her kindness as something more? It was the evening of the third class when I finally walked in and felt the tension settle around me like a familiar coat. Mrs. Whitmore was standing at the front of the room, already organizing the materials. As I entered, our eyes met, just for a moment, and I felt that familiar pull again, that quiet current between us. "Good evening, Mr. Jensen," she said, her voice low but warm. Her smile was a little softer tonight, a little more thoughtful. Maybe it was just my imagination, but there was something different in the air, something we both recognized but hadn't yet addressed. I took my seat and tried to focus on the lesson. But even as she spoke, it was hard to ignore the pull. Her words became distant, muffled by the way my mind seemed to gravitate toward her. And then, just as I was about to lose myself in my thoughts, she turned to me again. "Mr. Jensen," she said, her voice cutting through the haze of my thoughts. "Would you mind staying after class? I'd like to speak with you for a moment." My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't unusual for a teacher to speak with a student privately, but there was something in the way she said it that made my pulse race. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and after the class ended, I lingered in my seat, watching her as she spoke with the others. When the room finally cleared, she motioned for me to approach. I stood slowly, my movements hesitant, unsure of what was coming next. I could feel my palms sweating, my heart still thumping in my chest. But I couldn't look away from her. She was standing by her desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her, waiting for me. "Mr. Jensen," she began, her voice low and deliberate. "I've noticed that you've been quieter than usual these past few days. Is everything okay?" I was taken aback by her question. How did she notice? How did she know I'm fine, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure I was telling the truth. Just thinking about things. She studied me for a moment, her gaze soft but unflinching. There was an understanding in her eyes, as though she had seen more than just a student before her, as though she recognized something in me that I hadn't shared. "I get the feeling that you're not just thinking about the class," she said gently, her tone almost coaxing. "And I think you know it's okay to talk about it, right?" The words hung in the air, pregnant with meaning. My breath caught in my chest, and suddenly, I felt vulnerable. Too vulnerable. But I couldn't look away from her. I felt like she was waiting for me to say something, anything. I took a deep breath, unsure of how to begin. It's been a long time since I've really connected with anyone," I said, my voice wavering slightly. "Not just like this. Not in this way. It's hard to explain, but there's something about this class, about you, that's made me realize how distant I've been from everything." She nodded slowly, as though she understood exactly what I meant. "It's not easy, is it?" she said, her voice soft and warm, like a balm. "To open yourself up again. After so much time." I nodded, surprised at how easily the words came now. It felt like I had been holding something in for so long, and now that I was finally speaking it, I couldn't stop. "I didn't expect it," I said, looking down at my hands. "To feel this way. About anything. But it's hard to ignore it." There was a long pause, and when I looked up again, I saw something different in her eyes. It wasn't pity or sympathy. It was understanding, respect even. And I felt my heart calm just a little. "I'm not trying to make this complicated," I added quickly, unsure of how she might take my words. I guess I didn't expect to feel like this again. Not at this point in my life." She smiled softly, a reassuring, knowing smile. "You're not the only one, Mr. Jensen," she said. "Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. But that doesn't mean we should push those feelings away. It's okay to be human. It's okay to feel connected." I swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over me. I had expected a reprimand, maybe a gentle reminder about boundaries, but she hadn't given me that. She had given me permission to feel, to acknowledge something I hadn't let myself confront for so long. For a long time, we simply stood there, the silence stretching out comfortably between us. There was no rush to fill the quiet. No need to say anything more. I felt something shift inside me, a quiet understanding that I hadn't realized I was craving. Finally, she spoke again. "Mr. Jensen, I want you to know that you're not alone in this. We all carry our stories, and sometimes, they become a bit too heavy to carry alone. But you don't have to. Not here. Not now." Her words were like a soft hand on my shoulder, grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. I didn't know where this connection would lead, if anywhere. But I knew one thing for certain: I was no longer the man who had walked into this class weeks ago, unsure of what he was looking for. I was different now. I had opened up to something, someone, that I hadn't anticipated. I looked at her one last time, this time with a calmness I hadn't felt before. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady. "I needed to hear that." She nodded, offering me a small but meaningful smile. "You're welcome, Mr. Jensen. Just remember, it's okay to feel." And as I left that room that night, walking out into the crisp evening air, I couldn't help but feel lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from me. Maybe not completely. But enough. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or the day after. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was on the right path. And for that, I was grateful.